Hi everyone, I'm Matt Humphreys. Welcome back for week 2 of UX Design Fundamentals. Now before we get into the material this week, I want to start with a little bit of housekeeping. If you haven't found out so far, there are a few online resources that you need to be able to access to interface with this course. First is StuView, which is George Brown's repository for student schedules and marks. You'll probably need to interface with that a lot less than the second one on our list, which is called Blackboard. I'm sure you already have access to Blackboard or you wouldn't be seeing this video. I also wanted to point out that all interactions should occur through Blackboard. Whether you're submitting an assignment or writing a quiz, all of that information needs to be stored and tracked in Blackboard in the one system of record. When it comes to emailing me, however, it's best to do that directly from your email client, as the Blackboard system doesn't actually let me reply to your email address. So, if you've emailed me so far directly from Blackboard, I will not be able to reply directly to you, although I did receive it. So please resend your message from your own email client. Last week, I assigned homework, and I wanted to start by talking about that. I'm sure you've already completed it, and I hope you had an interesting time gathering those websites. As a recap, you had to evaluate 6 websites in 3 different categories: information, entertainment, and shopping. One example of a bad experience from each of the 3 categories, and you need to explain why. And one example of a good experience from each of the 3 categories, and you needed to explain why. I hope you enjoyed gathering up all of those great and poor user experiences and really digging into what makes a great experience and what makes a bad experience. I'm sure throughout this exercise, you started to realize this key point that I want to make before we get into our lesson today. Bad design does not equal bad UX. Just because something has a weak font combination or the color isn't great, that doesn't mean the experience itself is poor. Bad UX relates directly to friction caused by specific elements of design. Just because something has an odd color doesn't necessarily mean it's bad UX. However, if that odd color causes doubt in the user's mind that the site is trustworthy, or slows them down in the path to their conversion point, then it can be considered bad UX. Another example would be typography. If the experience uses typography that isn't so common, that doesn't mean it's bad user experience. If the website or application uses typography that isn't the most attractive, that doesn't necessarily correlate to bad user experience. However, if the experience is impeded by the typography choice, whether it be difficult to read or interpret, or some of the characters aren't legible, that would qualify as bad user experience. So, be careful with your experience critiques when it comes to personal opinion regarding bad design and aesthetics. What you need to take into account is whether the experience is impeded by those choices. Let's start by talking about the idea of user experience design. A little bit of a recap from last week to get us started. Of course, websites can work like people want them to. In the advent of website design in the 90s, we first started seeing products that were created from a company's point of view. They were likely a representation of a catalog or a system that existed offline. And it wasn't really clear that these companies should create websites that respond to their users' needs. If you take a user-centric approach to website creation, that's when user experience is taken into account. Otherwise, it's a constant battle for your user to find what they're looking for. Discoverability, findability, all very important aspects of user experience design. When it comes to user experience design, keeping your users in mind isn't hard. It's elementary. In our user-centered design process is one that considers the needs, wants, and limitations of end users of a product, service, or process. And they're given extensive attention at each stage of our design process. I'll iterate again that user-centric design isn't a suggestion. It's a process that is proven in a practice that we'll be reviewing throughout the rest of the class, starting today. Let's take a look at some user-centered design principles. It's important that we have a clear understanding of user and task requirements before we get started. One cannot begin to design an experience without fully understanding the requirements of the product and of the end user. Part of the user-centric design process involves incorporating user feedback to define these requirements. It's imperative that users be consulted throughout the process so that we can understand fully where we can improve the experience. Early and active involvement of the user is also very important in evaluating the design of our product. We also need to integrate user-centered design along with other development activities. We need to continue to integrate user-centric design throughout the development process as well. It doesn't just end at design handoff to the development team. And finally, it's an iterative design process. Everything about design means that you fail multiple times before you get it right. And there's no difference in the user experience process. We make multiple attempts at the ideal state of our design and test it on our users. That's how we make decisions on the best practices for a specific industry. I wanted to add one thought to the diagram we reviewed last week. If you change the design late in the process, then it will typically cost 10 times more than if you changed it during the requirements stage. When we reviewed this diagram last week, we talked about the decisions made at the lower planes and how they would affect the choices and the paths you can take at higher planes. It's very true that if a design change is made in the surface plane without considering the previous 4 planes, that change can greatly affect the amount of reciprocal change that needs to happen. The cost of fixing an error after development is 100 times more costly than fixing it beforehand. We take the time to evaluate every single aspect of our process so that we can make sure that this doesn't happen. So, why does user experience matter? I'm sure you've spent enough time thinking about that over the last week. But as a recap, let's take a look. It matters because a good experience is worth repeating. Fundamentally, a user will return to a website that they enjoyed interacting with. They will open an app again and again if they had a pleasurable experience. And they will log in to an interface at their office or in a public space if they feel comfortable and they enjoyed it previously. Good experience matters because the return on investment will be higher. Satisfactory and pleasurable experiences will have different impacts on ROI. Keep in mind that there's always an ROI, and it's absolutely measurable. We discussed last week what our ROIs could be and how to quantify them, and I hope that you reviewed that in detail. Here are a few of the return on investment examples that we looked at last week. Impressions or views of a specific page or element of a page can be measured as a success metric. Conversions are the most important one that we looked at last week. Conversions are points in our experience where a user achieves a specific goal. Registrations are users exchanging their information for some sort of benefit, whether it's an account or storage of information or the ability to recount something that they've shared. Sales are purchases online or through an application. A return on investment that's even more valuable than the initial sale could be a repeat sale for a specific consumer packaged goods client. And another one that we didn't specify last week is one called adoption. Learning a new process and bringing it into your daily life could be a great return on investment for specific users. Say, for example, you're creating a common app that tracks the weather or allows a user to determine the best diet item to eat. That type of adoption into a regular use structure is an absolute return on investment for applications. Let's take a little recap from last week's lesson and talk about the planes of user experience. I'll start from the bottom up. Strategy is the first plane, and it's what the company and users want to get out of an experience. Scope is next, and it's a description of the way that features and functions work together. Structure is the third plane. In the structure plane, we define how users go from page to page or point to point and how they end up discovering new things. The fourth plane is skeleton, and it's a combination of three practices: interface design, navigation design, and information design. And finally, the one that everyone gets excited about is the surface plane, where sensory design becomes a reality and brand takes life in the digital space. This week we'll be talking about the strategy plane, which is the first plane of the user experience process. In the strategy plane, we'll concentrate on user needs and product objectives. And before we get started with today's lecture, one final point about using the elements. It is a process, and it's quite important to make sure that we follow it. We'll focus on applying these elements one by one, today with a focus on the strategy plan. We'll learn how they depend on each other and why sign-offs between the planes are so extremely important. We'll talk about content, we'll talk about behavior, and we'll talk about technology. because they're all codependent on each other. If you need to, take a few moments to review the material from last week or reference the Jesse James Garrett text. And we'll see you in the next module.